Welcome back to Behind the Play. My name is Alex Adams, and today I'm very excited to introduce Sean Fitz-Gerald, Senior National Writer for The Athletic. Thanks so much, Sean, for taking the time and coming on.
Thanks for having me.
I first want to ask you, Sean, a little bit about your career. Was there a moment or when did you first think that you might want to pursue a career in sports journalism?
I'm not qualified to do anything else. I'm not very good at math. Science just terrified me. I have no other qualifications. I'm not handy. I can't hammer a nail in straight to save my life. I don't do well in the heat. It just really winnowed down the number of things that I could possibly do. It was either this or nobody answered my audition tapes that I sent in for the Blue Man Group. So it was down to those two, Blue Man Group and sports writing, and this is the one I ended up at.
Awesome. That's great to hear. And tell us a little bit about your journey, maybe how you started and to maybe where you are now at The Athletic.
Yeah, no, yeah, I went to a school that was then known as Ryerson University,
Hmm.
now Toronto Metropolitan University. I was fortunate enough to, work at the campus paper, the Eye Opener. Met my future wife at the Eye Opener. And then, yeah, a series of internships, the Hockey News, the Kingston Whig Standard, the Toronto Star. And then one I got in at the National Post. And I ended up working in the sports department there for 15 years.
Wow.
Moved to the Canadian Press for a bit, moved to the Toronto Star, and in 2016, made a jump to the Athletic, which was then operating in Chicago and had just recently opened in Toronto.
Mhm. And with that, for your writing itself, like what would you say your process is? Like obviously, we'll talk about a little bit about the book, but just for like a daily or your normal writing for The Athletic, what is your process like? If you could give us a little bit of an inside look.
Yeah, I mean, the process for my writing is agony, a lot of pain, some tears. Every time you open up a new sheet, that blank screen and the cursor is just blinking at you, staring and mocking you. That's my process. I mean, over the years, has it changed a lot? I don't know that it has. I mean, to get super wonky about it, I sat next to Bruce Arthur for years and years at
Yeah.
National Post. And his process and my process are very different in that he doesn't seem to have a process. It just congeals into like often very, 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 very good work. But what he will do is, and I have tried to adopt some of it, is that when he's in the reporting or when he's, say transcribing, or when he's sitting there in an idle moment, if a passage or a point or a structure comes to him, he'll sketch it out. So if he
Mm.
comes up with a line or a piece or a transition or even a section of text that he knows is going to make it into the story, he'll type it into the screen and then come back to it later. Whereas for me, I always and still do, I have to have my top. I
Okay.
have to have my first paragraph, two paragraphs, three paragraphs before I can do the rest. I mean,
Yeah.
more or less, that's still the same. That's been the same since I started in 1996 or whenever to today. I still can't, I don't have the mental capacity to sort of build, in a non-linear fashion. I have to go top to bottom. Bruce can write sections and chunks, and he has the sort of intellectual capacity to be able to knit it all together. Chris Jones, who used to work at National Post and went on to Esquire, I got to sit next to him for a while too. He would sometimes write the kicker.
Huh.
He would write the exit for his story,
Huh.
right? So the last couple paragraphs that you'd read, and he would write that first,
Hmm.
especially for long features. I mean, news breaking, whatever, that's a different thing. But where he had a chance to really sit down with a piece, he would write the end first, because that's how the reader leaves the piece. So that feeling, that idea, that conclusion, he would write that first and sort of work his way to the ending from there. And
Wow.
that's 3D chess. I could never work my way that way.
That's crazy. That I can't. Yeah, no, I'm the same with you. I can't even imagine
Nope.
that. And with that, you write a lot of features, and you alluded to that a little bit. what do you think makes a good feature story, and yeah, what makes a good feature story in your mind?
I mean, there's a bunch of different kinds, right? There's, process, how things are done, kind of feature stories. In the Globe and Mail, Greg MacArthur, Robin Doolittle, the incredible staff that's over at the Globe, they can have a bunch of different kinds of features. So one was, I want to say, I'm not gonna get the name of the company right, so I won't say it, but basically it was a series of buildings downtown and cost overruns and just really, you really have to get into know um, how things went crooked, how things went sideways. There's a lot of reporting. So it's not a lot of literary flourishes. I think MacArthur was on one of the bylines there. Just incredible. But it's like how it's done, the nitty gritty, not a lot of florid prose. That can be fantastic too. But then one where it's a scene, or you're trying to evoke emotion, to really convey what you're seeing in front of you. Those can be super powerful too. Like there's that's the thing with features, it can be all kinds. It can depend on the story. And every single one of them can be powerful in their own way.
And what are the stories that you most enjoy writing about?
Oof, again, I mentioned the pain thing. Um, I I'm sometimes even more terrified when I do trip over my way to finding a decent story, because the pressure is to stick the landing, right?
Mm,
Like there's one thing to be able to report a story and find a story, uncover a story, or see a story in front of you. And it's another one to sort of be able to convey everything that you're feeling, everything that your senses, your five senses sometimes, and convey that to readers. So I've been really fortunate to go to some really interesting events over the years. And yeah, that is a huge challenge, that when you're at an event, to convey what you're seeing, feeling, hearing, to a reader who might not pick it up for 24 hours.
yeah.
Even with the web, right? Like it's instantaneous, but that doesn't mean all your readers are going to find it right away. Maybe they only open up the app once every day, so they might not catch it right away. So, how do you convey what your senses are telling you to somebody who might not pick it up? And
Mhm.
that gives me the night terrors sometimes,
And
because I don't think I can do it.
yeah, and how do you push through?
Lots of coffee. Um, Yeah, you know what? Every day it sounds stupid, and I'm not being sarcastic here, but every day it's the same challenge.
Mm,
Every single day, every single story. Um, it's because no two stories are the same, no two settings are the same. That's the beauty of kind of being in sports or anywhere really.
yeah,
Like, no two city council meetings are the same.
yeah.
No two court cases are the same. That, being a journalist, being a print journalist, or television, radio, they all have their storytelling techniques and challenges and nuances. But the beauty of this job, of this field, um, is that no 2 days are the same. So
Mhm.
every time I open up a screen, it's a brand new feeling of terror that washes over me.
And with that, I don't know if it was a terror for you to write a book compared to a story, but yeah, you're nodding for the audio listeners.
Yeah, sorry, I'm also shivering. Yeah, that's a whole new thing. And honestly, that's really interesting in the context of like what you're asking. Um, like I'm not a smart person, right? I I, I worked in a steel mill through high school to help pay my way through university. Like I do not come from a background where, I had a lot of exposure to the arts when I was a kid. Like I don't have the intellectual capacity to be able to see a story. Like, uh, you know, two series just came to an end, right? Apple just ended Ted Lasso,
Yeah,
maybe, and Barry just ended on HBO. And both of those writing crews have been quoted saying that, they basically built their story arcs in the beginning.
yeah,
Right. So all of these things, like 4 seasons of Barry, 3 seasons of Ted Lasso. Like that was basically done. I don't have that ability to do it, right? Like I could never conceive of something like that, which is, why daily journalism kind of works for me, because I can go day to day to day. So when you come up with a book, I'd always read people saying, oh, they lost themselves in a book, or they felt lost. And I never quite understood it. Again, like, I grew up at the mill, reading the papers every day to day, sort of task to task to task was sort of how I grew into whatever it is I do, right? The idea of big picture and things like that, that doesn't come naturally to me. So when the book came, um, all of a sudden, you have all the reporting, all of the things that you'll pick up through journalism, right? The reporting, what is the story? But then when you came down to writing it, and this thing was going to be 100,000 words, there is no structure. There's no format laid out for you. Um, there's no guideposts. In a daily newspaper, when you're doing a 600-word story, even if it's not super clear to you, you can generally find the lead, your top, the context, and maybe, with all respect to Chris Jones, sometimes you can just get a kicker, and 600 words, you're filed by deadline, that's it. With this thing, I honestly, I think I rewrote the preface like 5 times,
Wow.
because you start it and you're like, where am I going with this? The idea of plotting, of charting, was totally foreign to me. I'd never really thought about it before because I never really had to. So with something this big, yeah, like after trying in a couple of false starts, I did try and teach myself how to plot, how to chart things, how to build pathways and bridges and that sort of thing. And going back, it was a 3-year process. I goofed a lot, and I'm happy with what came out. But if I was to do it again, for sure, there'd be different changes. Like, for how visual a learner I am, remember those big 3-panel cardboard displays you do for your high school science
Yep.
class,
Yep.
maybe even middle school science
Yeah.
class,
Yeah.
right? Like I am writing a story about a project about photosynthesis, and here's my 3 panels. I had one of those here on my dining room table, and I
Wow.
had a series of cue cards that were about the size of my iPhone, and I'd write,
Yeah.
because I'd have
Wow.
all the information, and I'd put it up on the board. And, I'd stand back and I'd look at it. I'm like, no, this belongs up here. This belongs here. And that was the only way I could come up with a structure or a flow, that I had to see it. Okay, the story goes from here, here, then up here, then, and even then I still didn't quite get it. And when it came to the writing of it, it's that blank page again. It's that terror of, I don't know where I'm going. I'm in charge of this, navigating this road, and I don't have a clue what I'm doing. It was a lot of trial and error. Like that was unlike any experience I've ever had. And I guess I started this about 20 years into the business. Um, and I'd never had an experience like that before.
And with that, how did you manage to kind of guide the plane into the terminal and bring the book all together and make it make sense and everything?
I had on the book, as I've been very lucky in newspapers as well, to have just a fantastic editor, Jordan Ginsburg, who used to work at National Post, helped launch Hazlitt, works at McClellan Stewart, which is part of Penguin Random House, and is a genius on top of being one of the most patient people I've ever come across in my life. Because, as you might tell, I can be kind of neurotic as well. So it could be every day, whether it be reporting or in the writing. I'd shoot that poor man texts, emails, voicemails saying, I don't know what I'm doing. This doesn't work. Help, help, SOS. And he'd always send me a note back, or have a call, or have a meeting, a breakfast, a coffee, lunch. He bought me a bunch of beers one day in a particularly challenging period. He was fantastic. He was a counselor, he was an editor, he was a friend. And without Jordan, yeah, no. whatever it was, I mean, whatever value judgment you want to make on the book, if you didn't like it, it would have been worse. If you did like it, it was because of what his presence was.
And with that, to pivot slightly, because the book is about the Peterborough Petes, and what's it been like for you to see them make the Memorial Cup like this year? Sadly for me, they beat my Ottawa 67s on the way there, but what was that like for you?
Would have been nice if they did it in 2017, 2018. And when Jordan, again, over beers, not that beer should be a recurring theme, I guess, but when he hatched the idea of doing something like this, the Peach just happened to be building up towards a run. They had an older team. They'd gone out and they'd acquired talent, and they started that season, the season we were following them, ranked top 10 in the CHL for the first time in quite some time. And then at some point around Remembrance Day, they just forgot how to play hockey, which isn't very good for a hockey team. And they missed the playoffs, which is a very difficult thing to do in the OHL sometimes. So yeah, watching them now, I mean, the turnover is so high. I mean, all the players are long gone. Some of them are now through university. But yeah, some of the front office staff, 2/3 of the coaching staff, it's the same. So just knowing the road that they've all gone through, it's been fun to watch. I'm happy for them.
And in your book, you kind of talk about there being this crisis in hockey and in Canada, and maybe tell us what the crisis is in your mind for hockey, and has anything changed in your mind since writing that book in 2019?
It's gotten worse. Um, yeah, I mean, the crisis in hockey, it's pretty well documented about the cost, priced itself out. But more than that, and I think what hockey people were initially maybe slow to grasp onto is that cost isn't the only issue. It might not even be the primary issue anymore, because all of sports is expensive, which is another issue, but we can get
Yeah.
into that later. At U Sports, it's just not attractive. It's not inclusive. It's not accessible. Um, you walk into any rink here in Toronto, um, and it doesn't feel like you're in Toronto anymore. Like it's not representative. There are so many communities that are not adequately represented inside the rink. So there's that aspect of it. The culture aspect of hockey, has been pretty well explained, I think, a lot through the work that Rick Westhead's been doing over the last several years. Rick Westhead, the senior correspondent at TSN, both interpersonally, as he's explored through the Kyle Beach
Yeah.
incidents with Chicago, and also, administratively with some of the work that he's been doing around the Greater Toronto Hockey League and how these franchises can sort of be bought and sold, which isn't really great for minor sports either. So yeah, hockey in Canada is at an existential crossroads, and it was in 2016 when we started the project. It might have made its path. It might have made its turn since then, and I'm not sure, since it's left those crossroads, that it made the right path.
Is there
Hockey's,
anything,
hockey's in trouble.
yeah, is there anything hockey, is there any sign of hope? Is there anything, what do you think needs to change other than maybe everything? Where do you see, is there any pathway for it to become more inclusive? Sorry.
Yeah, I
And
mean, all of youth sport, not all of youth sport, a lot of youth sport is exclusive because it's expensive. It's exclusive because it's inscrutable to get into. If you're not in the system, how do you navigate your way to get into the system? How do you get your child into rep soccer or competitive swimming or diving or anything, right? So there's that part. It's the inaccessibility on the ground floor. For hockey, it's that times 12. That if you're, in the olden days, if you wanted to play hockey, you can go to the local pond. There's a local team. It's pretty set up easily, right? Today, like if you're in Toronto and you're totally new, you can, even if you find your local rink, and there's no good easy way to find even your local rink. Like there's no website I can go into saying, here I am in East Toronto, where is my local rink? So say I find that local rink, which isn't easy to find to start with. I walk inside There's a bunch of old trophies, a bunch of pictures of old white dudes holding trophies. But there's no like, hey, sign up here if you're new to hockey. Not a single sign. And I can say that confidently about every minor hockey rink in this city, saying, hey, sign up's here. Here's how you get in. So then you're left to the internet. And every minor hockey association has its own website. It's really hard to find out where the local rink is, what days they play, how much it costs, what equipment you need, and like base stuff, like what's AAA? Is my kid AAA? What's the difference between AAA and AA? What's House League? I've never heard of House League before. What's Learn to Play? All of these things should be made easy for the user at the ground level. They're not. It's impossible. So even if you have interest, which, you know, fewer and fewer people have interest because hockey's inaccessible. Even to make that step, hockey makes it hard, right? And that's on top of making underrepresented communities feel welcome in the rink, inviting them to the rink in the first place. So yeah, like for me, if I was in charge, and to be clear, up to this moment, at 12:22 on Thursday, June the 1st, nobody's called me to offer me this position. But if I was running it, I would have a national strategy. So all of that money that Hockey Canada has been getting over the years, you know, and spending it on the $5,000 hotel rooms for board members to go to Prague and watch the Ivan Halinka whatever tournament, maybe start using some of that money to create a national strategy to help folks at the grassroots, at the local community levels, to help resource them, to support them in making meaningful connections with their community. Because I'm not saying that, you know, one size fits all national program is going to work in Halifax or Toronto or Prince Rupert. But empowering the local volunteers to say, hey, look, here's some resources, here's some people you can call, here's some best practices to make inroads with underrepresented communities, to reduce the barriers to entry, whether that be, you know, equipment banks, you have gently used equipment that you can pass on to new users, best practices for, you know, this worked in the lower mainland in BC to help get new folks into the rink. Maybe you could try this here. Whether that be, you know, different liaisons or people introducing ball hockey in schools or any of these things. I think that, you know, redirecting some of the money that maybe, you know, we're using at the national level to win gold medals on super high elite levels at the expense of the grassroots. It's kind of like the snake eating its own tail. If you keep ignoring the grassroots of the game, eventually you're not going to have much of the game.
Well, that obviously doesn't sound great for the future of hockey in
Nope.
Canada and elsewhere. But I mean, I do see some positives, but I think you're definitely hitting it on the nail there, and not to mention concussions and just safety for players themselves, and fighting and everything. I want to switch as best as I can to how you write. What I find really interesting, a bit about hockey media, and you wrote about SDPN, which I really like those guys out there, and you actually helped me. I had David Amber on the podcast, and you wrote a little piece about him, so I got some little information there. But what's drawn you to write about hockey media, and just why are you drawn to those types of stories?
It's funny that sometimes in the comments under the stories, people are like, is it a slow news day? Why are you writing about this? Why are you writing about your friends in the media? I wish I had a lot of friends. I'm a very lonely person. No, I mean, especially through TV and radio, as a sports consumer, you consume it through that lens, right? Like, unless you have season tickets in Toronto for the Leafs, Raptors, Jays, Argos, Toronto FC, and you're in the stands for every single one of those games, like, guess what? You're going to be consuming some of that product through the lens of these sports media companies, whether that be, you know, TSN or Sportsnet, who basically carved up all of the pro sports in Canada. So part of your experience in sports is through those folks, right? That, you know, if Hockey Night in Canada gets an audience of whatever it was, like 3.1 million on linear TV for a Leafs Lightning game. Like that means 3.1 million sports fans probably caught parts of Ron McLean or Dave Amber or Elliot Friedman or Kevin Bieksa or Jen Botterill, Anthony Stewart.
Mhm.
That's part of your experience. They are, for lack of a better term, part of the show, right? Sports is entertainment, and they're part of that. So my interest in that landscape, in those people, in their approach to storytelling, in the business side of it. Yeah, I mean, over the years, and it's just a function of getting old. I've just sort of developed an interest in it too.
Mm, mm. And I'm going to ask you a little bit about the Leafs, but before I go into that, what advice would you give to young journalists coming up in the industry?
A lot of folks, and it's not new. Like when I was graduating from university, and I graduated in 2000, people were like, oh, the industry's in a tough spot. There were hiring freezes in the 80s, which is well before my time. Like the industry's always been full of people saying it's a terrible time to get into the industry. Um, so it's a terrible time to get into the industry. But I think, if you're still in university, if you're in college, if you're new in your career and you're in your 20s, I'd also argue that maybe in the history of this profession, there's never been a more exciting, dynamic, prosperous potential future in the industry. That the industry is changing, and not just in print, but I mean in audio, in video, and what it even means to be print, audio, video. Like it's congealing, right? Um, like I am working for a company that didn't exist 8 years ago. Um, take a look at, Adam Wild. You mentioned SDPN earlier. Adam Wild just quit his job as a morning radio
I
host
saw that.
to focus on SDPN, which again is a company that was only incorporated 12 months ago,
Oh my
and
God.
that started or has roots in a dude literally yelling into his computer in his parents' basement, 17 years ago about the Maple Leafs.
Yeah.
Um, it's not easy now. It's really hard to make a living as a young journalist in this field right now. There's no denying that. It's really difficult to be an older journalist in this field right now because the traditional companies are scaling back in dramatic ways, really difficult ways. But if you're young and I mean you're developing skills naturally that people like me would have to really study to pick up, um, I think you're positioned for wherever the future takes this business. People will
Mhm.
always need trustworthy information. Um, and I think, being there as the industry changes and finds this new path forward opens up a lot of potential for folks who are willing to stick through some pretty
Mhm.
choppy waters right now.
Mhm. Yeah. No, I'll definitely take that to heart as a young person who didn't go to journalism school and trying to do this podcast. So I definitely will take that to heart and thank you for sharing that. And now I
I
want to
mean,
go to the
take
lead.
SDPN. SDPN is a great example, right?
Yeah.
Like it really does. And again, like it's not going to be immune from market forces moving forward. But what it shows to me is that, content that's good can find an audience and will find an audience, and there is a market for that. Like they have a 3-story office space in, just on the east side of the Don River, looking onto downtown Toronto.
Yeah.
They have full-time employees now. They don't have outside investors. They
Wow.
built that up. Now, it was over the course of many, many years. It wasn't overnight success by any means, but you're starting to see that, I think, in pockets across Canada. Canada is a small media market. So you can look to the US as well. But in Winnipeg, there's Illegal Curve,
Yeah.
there's Winnipeg Sports Talk.
Yeah.
You have other companies now like Playmaker Capital, which have, gobbled up a bunch of podcasts and helped launch a bunch of podcasts. Barn Burner out in Calgary is the reinvention of a Sportsnet morning show, and is now doing, apparently, from what I can gather from the data available, really good numbers.
Hmm.
Sikaris and Price in
Yeah.
Vancouver. Go Goat Sports has a suite of podcast offerings. Like, these networks are growing on the strength of the content and not because they're part of some big legacy brand.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. No, I definitely like I'm a Jets fan too. So I'm always watching Huss and stuff at Sports Talk, and I love SDPN as well. I applied and did get a job there, but I still love them, and they do such great stuff at SDPN, and I really hope they keep going up and up. And I want to ask a little bit about, obviously, SDPN. They love the Leafs, and I want to ask you about them. I know they've hired Brad Treliving just a couple hours ago when we're recording this, but I want to first ask a little bit about Kyle Dubas, and what do you, Sean, make of the departure of Kyle Dubas, and now that he's in Pittsburgh, and how would you assess his tenure as GM of the Leafs?
I mean, I think by the time he left, the expectation, I mean, this team hasn't won anything since 1967, right? They haven't been to a Stanley Cup final since 67, let alone winning. The city just went wild, celebrating a single playoff win, because that hadn't happened in 19 years. I think certainly he had successes. I think ultimately, from my perspective, this franchise is judged on, against its history, like good or bad. I'm sure it's really bad if you're in there, but at this point, yeah, you have to judge this team against its history and expectations. And you can go back through, go through the archives, and it's always been on the precipice before, and something's always held it back. So in terms of judging Kyle Dubas, I think he did some inventive things. I think, by what I've read from the people who know, he did really positive things about changing the office culture, about making sure people were empowered, excuse me, not entitled, empowered, and certainly modernized the front office. Ultimately, they didn't win. If Jim Treliving wins, then he'll grade out higher. If Jim Treliving loses, then we can
Brad,
talk about the grade.
yeah. You're saying Jim Treliving, that's his dad, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I was just reading about his dad. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Yeah, and with Brad Treliving, what do you think of him as the new GM? Obviously, he did pretty well in Calgary, but also had to trade Matthew Tkachuk. Like, I don't think he's a perfect GM, but what do you make of him being the new GM of the Leafs?
I mean, he would have had bosses in Calgary, right? So the whole notion of the Maple Leaf MLSE board, or Shanahan vetoing trades and having to navigate that, like, it's pretty hands-on ownership in Calgary too. I think Brian Burke would have been there in the very beginning of his run out there. And yeah, I mean, I didn't get to watch a lot of his press availability, but he seems pretty polished and pretty confident in dealing with the public part of his job, which is, not a small percentage of it. Yeah, like, again, that's all going to be borne out in the next 12 to 18 months, right? Like, you have some fundamental changes that are coming one way or the other to this franchise. So I'm going to withhold judgment until those are done, because that's where the proof's going to be in the pudding. For me, especially in this era, if this team doesn't win, then it's just another, frankly, this whole era would just be another failure on a pile of failures.
Yeah.
And at some point, I don't know what you have to start looking at. Like, there's different causes through the years of why this team hasn't succeeded. Historically, looking back, it becomes easier to trace back. And I do wonder if 15 or 20 years from now, we'll be able to look back and say, it was ownership. You look at the failures of the 70s, like, they were within a player or two, arguably, 78, 79, of challenging for the cup. They beat the New York Islanders to get to the semifinal. It was ownership that brought back Punch and Lack and broke up the core and traded Landon McDonald. You take a look in the early 90s, when they had Doug Gilmour and that big push with Felix Potvin, it was Steve Stavro who took over and wasn't properly capitalized, that the Leafs in a non-salary cap era had to start scaling back.
Hmm.
It was ownership. And now I wonder, um, if we look back, if ownership ever changes, that, we ever find out that, yeah, maybe Kyle Dubas had a line in on getting Keith Tkachuk. See, I'm going with the dads.
No.
Matt Tkachuk, and was overruled by Bella Rogers. I'm not saying that's happening, but
Yeah.
maybe it is an ownership. Maybe the curse of the Leafs really is the ownership. I have no idea.
Mm.
But
Yeah. No, I
when you
was going
grade
to
them
ask
out,
you.
I think it's a much bigger than just who's the GM, because I think there's a lot that happens in that boardroom that we're just
Yeah.
not privy to.
No, I know there's one member that I don't know enough, but seems to be always kind of pushing back. And I know that was affected the Masai Ujiri contract, who was the president of the Raptors. But
The Toronto Star wrote about that as well.
yeah. Very interesting reporting there. You kind of alluded to the piece that I wanted to talk to you about of how the Leafs have dismantled their core, and you alluded to their ownership over the years. But what would you do with the Core-4? Do you think it's the right move to blow it up? I find I'm very split on this personally, but what do you think Brad Treliving should do, and what's the best course of action?
I think we should ask Jim for living.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. I mean, they have lots of success in the regular season, right? That's hard to do, especially over a sustained period, which they've done. I don't know what the proper answer is. I know that there's certain challenges in certain ages and certain production levels of certain members of the Core-4, which are going to be intractable and create problems for everybody else. But do you get rid of one or more just for the sake of getting rid of one or more? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I can see what happens when you hold on to them too long, which is what is happening, ironically, where Kyle Dubas just went, where they've aged out and their window is closed. But that isn't the case here in Toronto. There's still lots of runway here.
How likely do you think they could do what maybe Washington and St. Louis did in terms of just holding on forever and ever and ever, every playoff loss, and then finally breaking through? And maybe next year, how confident do you think this team could actually win a cup in the next couple of years?
Confident Leafs Cup? Like
Maybe
1967.
just your brain
Like,
rational, maybe being rational. How
neither of us on this call, maybe even if you added our ages together, would have enough to get back all the way to 1967. Like, this franchise is trending dangerously close to like Boston Red Sox territory,
yeah.
right? Like, and in a league that, up until 2004, 2005, they had basically an unlimited advantage where they could have spent their way to whatever. They could have been the New York Yankees in a pre-salary cap world.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the credits for Kyle Dubas, is that, during his tenure, they did leverage their financial advantage to an analytics department, to growing out other ways, to making everything they possibly could first class. And I think that, unfortunately, in the public realm, that's not where he's going to be judged as readily. But I think it did make a big difference for the Leafs and their perception through the league. Leafs confident cup. You're never going to get me saying that.
No, that's fair enough. As a Sens fan, I'm just hoping there's a sale. So that's a bit different, but I'm not confident in anything right now in the NHL. So I definitely understand that. I want to quickly, before I let you go, just ask you a little bit about the Stanley Cup. Obviously, the final starts on this weekend on Saturday. Do you have a favorite? What do you make of the matchup versus Vegas versus the Florida Panthers?
I think it'll be fun. I think Vegas, they roll a lot of lines. They roll through their pairs. I think Florida is a lot of fun because of, what we've seen and how they've gotten through. I think it'd be neat to see, Paul Maurice, who walked away from the game, not that long ago, because he, essentially kind of felt burnt out. It's been interesting, fun, I don't know if the right word, to follow along as he sort of rediscovered this team that just barely scraped into the playoffs by a single point. And he's clearly been having fun and enjoying this. And he's one of the winningest coaches regular season in NHL history who's never won a cup. And this would be his opportunity. So in terms of narratives, even though it's Florida, Vegas, I think there's plenty for Canadian fans to follow if they want it to stay inside now that it's nice out.
Yeah, yeah. I quickly want to know how you feel about just those two teams and those two markets playing each other. Obviously, they're non-traditional hockey markets. Is that good for hockey in your mind in the NHL?
I've come to think that what happens at the NHL level, at the pro level, really doesn't have an impact on the grassroots game.
Mm,
Like I don't think that they're tethered as much as we think they are. I don't think that they really have a connection, wins or losses. Mike Russo has been doing some really good reporting, as he always does with The Athletic, about how this has sort of sparked something in Florida that had been absent since that Stanley Cup run in 93, 96,
96.
Is that sustainable? I mean, the franchise frittered it away over 20 years of failure. But, if this is a signal that, the team's going to be stable and can it build anything in Florida? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it really does depend more on what the teams do that we don't necessarily see.
Okay.
So like Dallas, again, when it moved, the Stars built a bunch of rinks to actually build the hockey community down there. I think that's the kind of work that when we say good for hockey, bad for hockey, that's the stuff that has to happen. You have to build facilities. In Toronto, there hasn't been a public facility built since 1967, the Centennial Fund.
Wow.
Like there are old rinks that are falling apart all across the city. They're like literally being condemned because they're physically structurally unsafe. So I think even in Toronto, like the Leafs can't get a free pass either. That you got to build facilities, you have to build community programs, you have to engage with the people who live in your area. Good for hockey, bad for hockey, based on what you do on the ice. I don't think that has any bearing. I think it's fun for TV ratings and might get you a temporary boost. But all of the work, good, long-term, good, bad, or otherwise, has to happen with ownership actually investing and making a connection in their communities.
Well, Sean, thank you so much for taking the time and doing this. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I just want to give you the floor. What are you working on at The Athletic? Anything people should stay tuned for? Anything you want to plug?
Nothing to plug right now. When we're done here, I'll probably go back to looking at an empty blank page and the cursor blinking and mocking me, and then start the whole process over again.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sean. I'm sure it won't be blank for too long, and I'm excited to read more of your stuff. And thanks so much for taking the time and doing this.
Thanks so much for having me.